have a human being that runs it. Her name is Ruthie Ditzler, and we love to see key takeaways that participants post about our events, and it helps others learn more about what we are doing in this community. Now, a big thank you to CSG Pro for sponsoring our DASL community. Sponsors like CSG Pro make our communities and events possible. And I'm not sure, is Greg out there? He does not appear to be, so I will give the little shout out, and maybe he'll join us a bit later. But for those of you who are not familiar with CSG Pro, they specialize in software and data analytics consulting, and they've been building modern, scalable software and data solutions since 1993 that are hell-bent on your success. I love when I can swear during one of our events that's recorded for posterity. All right, now without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to our community co-chairs, Matt and Leanne, who'll introduce our speaker this morning, Kathryn Darnell Helms, Chief Data Officer for the state of Oregon. And thanks so much for your leadership this year, Leanne. And Matt, take it away.
All right, I'm Leanne Shapro. I'm a product manager with ACA Group, and my co-chair, Matt.
I'm Matt Mitchell. I'm an analytics consultant with Focus Strategies. And we are very pleased today to introduce Kathryn Darnell Helms, Chief Data Officer for the state of Oregon. So Kathryn, would you take it away?
Yes, thank you so much. And while I get my screen shared, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I love the Tech Association of Oregon. I love being able to support local collaboration and sharing. I see some very friendly faces, both from the public and private sector here. I'm also going to put a link into the chat for Oregon's data strategy. Quite a bit of my presentation focuses on the development of Oregon's data strategy, so I thought it made sense for everyone to have access to a link. So I should be able to get my screen pulled up now, and folks should be seeing the presentation, but not the presenter view, and I'm hoping that's true. Excellent. Okay. So, well, and now you're not. There we go. As I was populating these slides, I realized that I kept producing and adding more and more content. So I will do my best to stay honest with time. And then I don't necessarily have access to view the chat. I'm comfortable being interrupted if there's a specific question about a slide as we get going. Matt or Leanne, please don't hesitate to let me know if it looks like there's a raised hand or a Q&A. Same with you, Riley, since I know you're managing our chat. So quickly this morning, I wanted to provide just a quick bio about me. So specifically the fact that I actually come to data through work in a very different context. So I come from a librarianship background, specifically archives and records management. And my previous work and research before I moved into the public sector roles that I've had for the city of Austin or now for the state of Oregon were focused on the use of government records as tools of truth and reconciliation in countries that had experienced human rights abuses. So that might have been the installation of dictatorships or genocide. So that means that on the public sector side, I'm really deeply steeped in this belief that access to data and information is how our constituents speak truth to power. It also means that I have a very, what I would call non-traditional lens when it comes to other chief data officers who might come from experiences as economists, statisticians, digital transformation leaders. I think there's a really diverse pathway to the chief data office. So I wanted to provide that caveat just so that you're aware that when you look at artifacts that are created by the state, you may also see a slightly non-traditional approach, right? So equity and justice are woven throughout our work in a fairly strong way. And it's because I come from that belief that interrogating the socio-political context of our data is just as important in how we, how we use our data to receive insight. So that's just sort of a quick blurb about me and how I got here and who I am. I joined the state in January of 2019 as our inaugural chief data officer. I'm tasked with quite a few things at the enterprise level. The first, obviously, is creation of our state data strategy. In addition, I'm building and establishing enterprise data governance in the state and guiding agencies in these areas of data governance, transparency. I also support a central GIS function and open data. So really a broad breadth of experience, or I should say breadth of areas of management for my office. And we'll touch on the CDO portfolio as a whole as well in a couple later slides. In terms of our agenda today, I did want to touch on the Chief Data Officer role, a little bit diving into the difference between a public sector CDO and a private sector CDO. I'll also discuss some about Oregon's data strategy development. So we'll go into the process of how Oregon built our first data strategy, and then we'll have a road mapping exercise and a discussion into how I've been building more of that roadmap and CDO portfolio. I wanted us to start with a poll though, because I wanted to get a good read for what kind of level of folks we have within the room, in addition to who might be in a place where they have a connection to a chief data office or another executive leading data efforts, or who may or may not have a CDO or data lead. And then who think that maybe they don't need one within their organization. I certainly won't make any judgments based upon how your organization or sector functions, but I would say even absent a CDO role, you frequently will need that centralizing force. So just wanted to see more about kind of what our population is like today. Okay, great. So I think we can just, is it possible to display the poll results? This is me showing my newness at polls. I think it's
actually sharing it. I think you have to stop sharing your screen to see it, or can other people
okay.
see it?
Or if I drag it over, can people see it? Excellent. Okay, so other people can see it. Thank you so much. So it actually looks like many or most of you have a CDO or other executive leading data efforts, or are in the process of advocating for one. So hopefully this presentation will provide some really helpful context about the Chief Data Office role. For those of you that already work with a Chief Data Officer, some of these preliminary slides might be a little bit basic, but I wanted to provide some full context. And I think specifically, I've made some observations about kind of the public sector Chief Data Office role versus the private sector Chief Data Office role that I think are a very helpful conversation. So I'll touch very briefly on these introductory slides, since it seems like most folks have some level of context for the Chief Data Office as kind of a member of your executive suite or a support function wherever they're located in your organization. So compared to many other C-suite roles, the Chief Data Office is relatively new. When I actually started graduate school, when I was still figuring out what I wanted to be when I grew up, the first public Chief Data Officer had not yet existed. So one of their primary duties, though, I think for the CDO especially, is this new addition to the C-suite, is really managing expectations. I think more than anything else, management of expectations has been really critical for the CDO role. And I think you can also see from this slide, right, the average CDO tenure is really short. It's about 2 to 3 years. And much of that comes from the breadth of what responsibility for data means, right? So because data touches every aspect of your organization, enterprise responsibility for data can quickly spiral into all of these other offshoots, right? Does the CDO own privacy? Do they own digital strategy? Do they own digital transformation? What about IT governance and how that intersects with, say, data architecture and the way that we build infrastructure for our organizations? I've also included a link to this Harvard Business Review article, the "Are You Asking Too Much of Your Chief Data Officer?" I think it's a very clear method, or I should say, like, it really helps crystallize those distinct roles that exist within the CDO. They list roles like Chief Analytics Officer, Data Developer, Data Defender, so if you're responsible for security or classification, Data Architect, Data Ethicist, so ethics are quickly becoming critical in how we manage and leverage, especially as we adopt automated decision systems or other machine learning technologies, right? Recognizing implicit bias that may exist within our data sets and making sure that we don't codify that bias through the technologies that we choose to implement in the future. incredibly critical. So I sort of hold fast to the idea that the Chief Data Office is really that centralizing force, setting the strategy for how the organization manages and leverages data, but it will still need support and engagement and resourcing from others to help deliver on that work or deliver on that vision. So it is my belief that data governance is really an implicit duty associated with any employee in an organization. So delivering that training, making sure folks have that expectation woven into their day-to-day management for data is really critical in making sure that the Chief Data Office role is successful. You can't have one person who's responsible for making sure that others are using data wisely, but you may have one person who's responsible for setting that guidance and policy and support. So if your organization is in a space where they're considering creation of this role, being cognizant of how quickly we can jump to that mission accomplished role when we get that first person into the position is important, right? So the existence of the Chief Data Officer does not automatically mean that your data is now magically governed. It just means that you have that person who's there to set those standards and strategies. I wanted to also drill a little further into public versus private Chief Data Officers. I also want to own that I am like a ride or die public sector person. So I do not have experience as a private sector CDO. For those of you who are on the call, please feel free to correct me in the chat or in Q&A. I'm mostly just sharing my observations, but I think one of the core observations that I've had from the public sector Chief Data Officer role is that because you're governing data that's not necessarily embedded just within your organization, you're also responsible for helping lead other state agencies or other city agencies. We also have city and public sector Chief Data Officers at city and county level. There's this huge diversity of stakeholder groups and even kind of mission and vision and values associated with the lines of business. You also have diversity of size and funding, right? So I support agencies that range in size from 1.5 FTE to over 10,000 FTE, and they are all attempting to manage, share, use, govern data in support of kind of this overall shared outcome of state government, right? Which is, you know, improving lives for Oregonians. But how they might approach that work is very different. There might be a public safety lens associated with it. There might be urban planning or land use. It might be related to water quality and safety, and even how we define Oregonians, right? So we also have agencies that might not be responsible for direct services to humans, but they are responsible for things like stewardship of flora and fauna or environmental conservation or protection of endangered species. So at a statewide level, this means that really the key difference here is my business value delivery is through the influence and engagement I can provide to state agencies and the support that I can provide them to do their best work. Whereas as a public sector CDO might have a direct analytics team, might be stepping more firmly into a chief analytics officer role where you're both setting the strategy and delivering directly on that strategy with data, right? It might be more tied into what Doug Laney might call like the infonomics perspective, right? Making sure that you're really capitalizing on your data as a business asset to deliver return on investment. Our position is still relatively young within the state of Oregon. So my role was created in 2017. I was tasked with open data, transparency, data governance, also analytics. We've actually now expanded my office. So when I joined, I originally had 5 staffers, most of whom were focused on geospatial data development or GIS analyst work. And I had a single staffer managing a transparency website. So we've actually now expanded my office and I have roles associated with performance management. I got my first deputy, which is really exciting. She has already saved me in multiple capacities and she's only been here about 8 weeks. So Rachel, if you're here, thank you so much. But we're also bringing on other ETL development and support roles and even some roles associated with data equity and justice. We'll touch a little bit more on some of the support roles that I've seen really critical in my office, but one specifically that I highly recommend you consider if you're either looking to build a chief data officer role or you have a CDO in your organization is someone invested in portfolio and program management. Because of the breadth of what a CDO does is so vast, if you aren't really transparent with about your resourcing and what you're able to take on, you're almost guaranteed to alienate your stakeholders, right? Because they'll think, again, that there's this magical role associated with all data attributes and they can solve all problems. And it might be that there's a very early on roadmap that they need to channel into first. So being able to build that transparency around my portfolio is actually one of my critical priorities. And with this in mind, we'll actually touch on the development of Oregon's data strategy, in addition to our roadmap for maturing the enterprise. So touching again on the distinction between public and private sector chief data officers, Oregon's data strategy is structured after the federal data strategy, and we'll touch a little bit more on what that structure is in the next slide. But it's also a very high level strategy. So it's not specifically an analytics or a business intelligence strategy. There's connection, but it's not identical to what you might see from a more concrete tactical strategy. Instead, it's a very high level vision for how the state manages data, in addition to concrete actions that we'll be taking over the next 2 years. And we'll touch on the structure where we've created some evergreen components of the data strategy associated with values work that we've conducted, in addition to concrete kind of tactical work that will take place over the next 2 years, and then we'll continue to kind of add on to those 2-year roadmaps. We also had a fairly extensive public comment and engagement period as part of this development. So I partnered with my Chief Data Officer Advisory Council, which is representation from state agencies, many of whom are either directors, assistant directors, or research directors in their own right. And we built components of the data strategy and then released them for public comment and feedback. We also contracted with community organizations to provide feedback on how we were approaching these concepts of equity and data justice, right? So making sure that we're being responsive to all populations that we serve within the state of Oregon, specifically as it comes to managing and kind of interrogating that cultural context of data. As I mentioned, we started at a very high level, and the first was really just establishing 3 core themes around how Oregon wanted to manage data. So these are kind of the pillars for how we classify or categorize most of our actions associated with managing data. The first is governance and effective management. So documenting, contextualizing, and understanding our data in order to receive value from analyzing it. The second is ethical use. So investing in data justice, investing in visibility, and also making sure that we have an ethics component into the work that we conduct. And lastly, and I think one of the most critical components of ours is that focus on data-informed culture. So we kind of shy away from the terminology of being data-driven. We would rather say that we're data-informed, because data doesn't necessarily drive where we're headed, but it does help form that path forward. So working to educate our employees and our partners, and there's even a component of how do we support Oregonians in being more data literate, so that when we publish open data or share analytic products, that they also have tools to analyze, engage with, and work with that data. We are starting, I would say, Oregon from a very low enterprise maturity level. We do have agencies who had their own internal data strategies, or even folks that were close to chief data officers. Our Department of Transportation is actually in the process of recruiting for their first CDO. So if you're interested in that role, that's currently being advertised, but we don't yet really have that structured agency chief data office role. So we had bright spots, but we didn't really have that central picture for governance. So the actions that we've prioritized over the next 2 years really focus on establishing that baseline, specifically around, do we have policies in place? Do we have a data inventory? Do we have that foundational awareness of data within our organizations? And even knowing what competencies we would expect from our staff, or how we could support them in upskilling if they maybe lack some data literacy competencies that we think are critical for their role.
Kathryn, we had a question come up about org structure. Do you have any data scientists in the org structure anywhere?
We actually don't. So that kind of touches back on my office specifically, not really being a central analytic or capability function. So the analysis of data really rarely resides with me, other than some support that my GIS analysts provide. We have a few state agencies that hire or recruit for data scientists, but Oregon also struggles a lot, I would say, with the compensation required of bringing on a data scientist versus a data analyst and the expectations of that role. So that's a great question. We don't necessarily within my office. I think a few of our larger agencies have folks who act within that role. I know our Office of DHS has a very advanced analytics team that has several folks who function as data scientists, but we do not specifically within my organization. So touching on these data principles, as I mentioned, our strategy focused a lot on building values work. So these 10 principles are really the foundation for all of Oregon's strategic work with data and are designed to provide that structure for how we build out future work. As you can see, these are very high level, right? These are goals for how we want to uphold and uplift specific actions with regards to our data. I think critically, knowing that we're managing data as a strategic asset for the public good and that we as a state really are making that cultural commitment to the importance associated with that work has been really critical. And again, building that baseline for us. If you're within the private sector, you may have less need for something this detailed, but connecting directly to the mission, vision, values of your organization is still important. And I think even that values and vision work is critical, right? So does our organization perhaps value ethics and privacy concerns that we want to uphold? Is there maybe even some level of like A over B value settings, right? We value data comprehensiveness and quality over speed of delivery. Components that might help guide where your organization wishes to go with data. So I wouldn't necessarily completely dismiss this piece of the exercise if you're looking to build a strategy. It just may not be necessarily as comprehensive as we were in building something for a massive and diverse statewide enterprise. Moving down another layer, we built out these practices, and we'll actually engage in a short exercise associated with these data practices. But this was really the ability to build those long-term goal statements. So as I mentioned, we have these principles that are really those evergreen. This is our value. These are our values for how we manage data. And then we've built practices that are designed to get us toward upholding those principles. And these are really considered our 10-year horizon. So we know that we won't tackle all of these things within the next 2 years, but we wanted to have some stretch goals in addition to some very immediate things. You can see number 4 on this list, if you can read it clearly, inventorying and identifying data assets within the state's possession might be a fairly quick one. We actually are undergoing our first inventory effort at the enterprise level right now. Whereas, building a holistic approach to data governance really involves formation of a much longer range program. So these practices informed our 2-year action plan, which are also included in the state data strategy for what we felt like we could accomplish from 21 to 23. And we're also in the process now of going through this exercise of sequencing and reviewing these practices again to look at what 2023 through 2025 looks like. So we've built these longer standing components of our state data strategy that we are in the process of that are consistently kind of maintained, right? So we won't necessarily revisit these practices next year, but we will revisit that biennial action plan and see what we were able to accomplish. So drilling down again into what these practices feed into, this is actually our high-level roadmap for what we're hoping to accomplish in the next 2 years. I can already tell you very openly and transparently, we bit off more than we can chew. Some of the items in gray are actually items that we have not yet been able to tackle. And this is where leveraging both my penchant for transparency to just say, oh my gosh, I bit off more than I could chew. I was really optimistic in this first 2-year plan. And also being able to leverage my advisory council has been critical. So as we've hit roadblocks, having the ability to say, I'll be honest, I thought this was a realistic time frame. I didn't realize there was more work we had to do before we got to this point. And then we have the ability to take action. This also touches on why I think it's so valuable to include components of portfolio management and governance in that chief data office. because having that role embedded in your organization means that you can build some more transparency around the portfolio, and also feeds directly into this need for the CDO to really be strong when it comes to managing expectations. So we've also done work around crosswalking these specific actions to our data practices to see which ones we're supporting most effectively and where we might have gaps. And that's what's starting to feed into conversations around 23 and 25. And so with that in mind, I'm actually going to shift us to talking more specifically about the data practices that I referenced in another slide. And then we'll have kind of a brief exercise piece. So I'll just move us over to talking more in depth about building our data practices. So the idea around these practices was to really elicit that wish list, right? What would you like to see from a fully mature data organization in 2, 5, or 10 years, right? And we tried not to put any sort of limitations when we did this work as a group exercise. We didn't really put any limitations around feasibility around the first piece of this, right? So I think we started with probably 55 practices and slowly winnowed them down or made others more comprehensive. But having that ability to really think far out into the future of, like, in a perfect world, what would my organization look like with how it manages or uses data, was really helpful for getting us to that, those principles. We also leveraged some of those ongoing organizational pain points. And I think for most organizations that are in the process of leveraging data or governing data, you'll probably hear consistently the same ones, right? We may not have what we consider a single source of truth. We might have disagreement about how different numbers are calculated. We may not always have a picture of every piece of data that folks touch. We might feel like employees who are further upstream in the process of creating data don't realize the impact that the decisions they make have downstream for people who analyze it. These are all fairly, I think, common pain points that folks address when it comes to governing and managing data. There's also the capacity to complete an organizational maturity assessment and even look at tools like DTAM, the Data Management Capability Assessment Model, or the Data Management Maturity Model from CMMI, although I think they're phasing out support for that tool, and just see what other maturity models might consider a mature organization. And the idea is to use this to build those practices. So are there defined outcomes or maybe even slightly more abstract practices that you would like to see within your organization, like establishing and sustaining a holistic approach to data governance, or completing that first organizational maturity assessment, or building a policy framework, or making sure that users have access to self-service BI tools, or that there's strong enough data warehousing capability that there are questions around kind of like system of record or single source of truth. So the idea is to be very broad-minded and open with how you're identifying these practices. And I think this is a great starting point to building the skeleton for that strategy. So with that in mind, and I realize that we're coming up on time because I can certainly talk for a long period of time, but I'm hoping that we'll take 5 minutes maybe to just have folks individually identify 2 to 3 data practices in one specific area that might be something that you care about with regards to data strategy or strategic management of data, however you are, or whatever role you have within your organization. You can kind of use your own lens here, but taking the time to maybe identify 2 to 3 of those practices in any of these areas, and see if you can identify practices from a range of maturity levels. And there is a link with sample practices from Oregon's data strategy that you can use, but kind of trying to build that internal maturity model. So I think we'll probably give 5 minutes for folks. If that's okay to do this work, we can also cut it down. I'm kind of asking for a quick time check here.
You're good on time, Kathryn. And maybe while people are thinking through that, we have a couple of questions that I think may also help people as they are working through the exercise. One, I think it's going specifically back to some of the work you're doing here in Oregon, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's asking, is the data publicly available and available for download on a data site for data scientists to use? That's Abe. I'm not sure I'm saying your name correctly. It looks like Bob just put a link in, Bob Leak, that may answer the question. Didn't do a great job on that one. Sorry, Kathryn. I have another question that asks what tool, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I would say in terms of state data being available publicly, Oregon is in the process of building their open data program. So I'll put some links in when we move to Q&A as well. We do have an open data portal. If you go to data.oregon.gov, it's not necessarily all data that state agencies have, but it does have the ability for, say, data scientists to scrape it using an API. You can also manipulate and build your own visualizations within the tool itself. So we have some data available, and we also have information about our open data program on that site available.
Excellent. And then what tool sets are you using for data inventory?
So because we're government, we're using a series of Excel spreadsheets. And that's pretty typical. So for many states, the process goes hire a CDO, launch an open data program, and usually a component of that open data program is an enterprise data inventory. So we have state agencies actually completing inventories on spreadsheets. I'm aware there are other tools available, but because of the distributed and decentralized nature of the state, we're actually just leveraging Excel. We're in the process of building some other requirements and expectations around kind of managing data or managing that inventory or internal catalog tools, but we haven't gotten there yet.
I don't think you need to say that government is the only industry that prefers the big spreadsheet as their system of record. We've got one more question. Can you please let us know, what do you mean by build OD literacy and capacity mentioned in the data strategy and roadmap portion of your presentation?
Yes, my apologies for the acronym. So open data. So specifically within the state, because we've just launched our open data program starting in February of this year, one of our intentions over the next biennium is to really build open data literacy and capacity. So familiarity for agencies in the process of publishing open data and sort of what it looks like to be proactively transparent by providing structured data. So it's kind of a specific type of literacy as we think more about receiving constituent feedback and proactively publishing data.
Excellent, thank you. And we may have talked through the 5 minutes that people were working on stuff. So I don't know if you want to do a check-in with folks and see if anyone wants to share, or they may have been listening and need more time.
If folks need more time, you can ping me with like a help please in the chat, or we can move on. It's not going to be perfect this first time around. It's just sort of exercising that muscle and gaining some experience in that area. Similarly, I wanted to just move us to kind of an open debrief time of like, how did development of these practices maybe contextualize or help support visioning for where your organization would like to go with data, or even other pros or cons you've observed. I will say, I think my performance manager maybe rolls his eyes at some of this practice work because it's very, the way we've structured it, at least in Oregon, there isn't a lot of requirements around like what is a milestone versus what is a performance metric versus what is like a long range vision for development of a program. So I know that's one of the critiques that we've been kind of grappling with even as we do our own work within our data practices. But I'll open the floor to other observations that folks had.
Ravi, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Kathryn, I'm the new CDO of North Dakota. I just started a couple of weeks ago, and it was music to my ears, everything that you just said today. So thank you for sharing. And I just wanted to say that, and I need to drop for a meeting, but it was a pleasure listening to you today, and I hope to connect with you. I'll send you a message offline.
Great, thank you and welcome. Welcome to the public sector CDO experience.
I appreciate it. I look forward to learning a lot of things from you. So thank you for being open and helping us all learn from your experience.
Bob, go ahead.
Hi, Kathryn. I remember when the state hired you and that's a tremendous amount of work that you've been able to do with your team through the efforts so far. Congratulations. I was looking forward to working with you as the CIO for Multnomah County, but chose a role now here in Las Vegas with Clark County. There were two practices I wonder if you would respond to. So one is a principle around getting departments to understand that we're going to share data unless we legally cannot. And then the second piece of that, and a peer of mine, Cindy Honnessy, is on as well. The second piece of that is no one can say whether we can or can't share data unless you're an authoritative individual who has the rights to say you can or can't. So an example of that would be, there's a lot of myth around what is and isn't HIPAA data or PHI. So I don't need a nurse to tell me what we can and can't share. I would like a HIPAA officer to say what we can or can't share, and extend that through all the other types of protected data that we have in public service, like CGIS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder what your thoughts are on those two principles.
Yeah, I am a big fan of the must share data unless, or what I started with was open by default, but I think must share data unless feels a lot less terrifying to folks. I also used to joke my first year here that I don't turn to dust if people say the word HIPAA, right? That I'm still probably going to have the conversation about data sharing, even if you have regulated data. It's just a matter of what can we share effectively and ethically. What we built in terms of some of our principles are around overcoming barriers associated with data sharing. And then we had principles in governance related to stewardship. We did also build in principles around protecting privacy and integrity, but with that idea in mind, it's knowing what is actually private. So we built some principles around that area. We have 36 principles, so I don't have them off the top of my head, but I'll see if I can extract them. But we did try to build in specifically looking at hurdles associated with data sharing within the state. Because privacy concerns and even, FERPA feels like it conflicts with HIPAA, which feels like it conflicts with 42 CFR Part 2. Those challenges have been really, really difficult as we negotiate. And Oregon's actually also in the process of looking for, I think, or hoping to create a chief privacy office, because I'm also a little bit out of my depth, right? I'm not a lawyer. I can't necessarily offer a legal opinion. So absolutely, I think bringing on that chief privacy officer role as a support measure is important.
Great, thanks.
All right, Bryant.
Good morning, Kathryn. I'm the Chief Information Risk Officer for the Oregon Department of Human Services and the Oregon Health Authority. And I'm really wondering how we encourage our agencies to get a chief data officer, to employ that so that we can make the kind of strategic advancements that you're talking about in our own organizations, so that we can support the work you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So from a public sector state agency perspective, I will say we're actually in the process of trying to ask for agency data officer roles at the state level. So that's a priority that my office is trying to push forward in 2023. So you may end up with a chief data officer whether your agency is asked for one or not. But in terms of, I think especially now that we're starting to see traction with our data governance policy, which is coming out in a couple months, we've been able to have conversations with agency directors around data governance is everyone's responsibility, but you still need someone who's there driving that effort forward, right? Like whether it's being that professional nag of, hey, did you ever write those data quality standards that you said that you would do? Or how do we structure or deal with or resolve conflict associated with data? But you also need that person who's providing that high level vision. And again, even managing expectations, right? That data is not magic and that there are tools that we have to use to leverage it appropriately, that we have to be cognizant of privacy. So having that person who's that bridge between your practitioners who are actively governing the data in those day-to-day trenches, in addition to providing feedback to leadership about what they might like to see from their data, you really need that middle person who's there to provide that support. So I'm happy to also share materials that we've used to advocate. I know that DHS and OHA have engaged my office for support with developing data strategies. And I think in that creation of a data strategy, many folks also see the implicit value of bringing on that other person, which we'll actually touch on a little bit in these other slides of how would you use something like this to start advocating for the creation of that role if your organization doesn't have one.
See another hand up, Safdar?
Thank you so much. This is Safdar here from calling you join this meeting from UAE, Abu Dhabi. I'm one of the head of data science with a local bank here. My key questions to Kathy and the team over here is usually when we start the initiatives, there is always an expectations towards benefit realization, the ROI part and everything. I know you did mention that you work for the public sector, but any inputs and guidance, how could we share this? Because we have initiated this data strategy, data management initiatives, key functions within the Dharma cycle and everything, but still we are yet to find out the benefit realization part, and in terms of ROI or anything, any feedback, any inputs on this would be highly appreciated. Thank you so much.
I think you have asked the question that plagues many a data governance professional, which is how do I quantify the value of not struggling to find data that I need, right? I will say I would recommend exploring Doug Laney's book, Infonomics. I think there's some really good feedback in there about kind of tying ROI and data together. Additionally, this is a place where we're just now starting to build some metrics in my office. We have an enterprise data governance program associated with geospatial data. And something we've realized is that while we steward these enterprise geospatial data assets, we haven't been tracking things like usage associated with them, right? So if every time a city or county downloads an enterprise road centerline data set, that represents time that they're not spending trying to create the data on their own or trying to stitch it together or trying to search for it. How do we quantify that effort? I think the spaces where states or governments specifically have been really successful is calculating the cost savings associated with open data. So if you see a decrease in public records requests as you start to publish more open data, I know Texas estimated that they save close to $3 to $5 million a year now on public records requests as a result of publishing open data proactively, just calculated based on the time required for a professional to seek out the data that's been requested, apply any redaction, provide it in a format that's usable, and then also answer any sort of follow-up questions. Whereas if you're already publishing that data in a standard format with data dictionaries and metadata, the bandwidth required to provide that support to a direct constituent request is phenomenal, right? So within a private organization, it may be using that same metric, but leveraging it in the sense that if we have self-service analytics or standardized data layers or standard data dictionaries and metadata templates, can we calculate the cost benefit savings of someone not having to create that on their own or having to go through the process of shoulder tapping, right? Well, I think that person knows, maybe that person knows, maybe this person knows where I can get that data. I think staff time is probably one of the clearest mechanisms that we see cost savings with data governance. But it is a challenge, I think, to put it into that direct financial monetary ROI at times.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Anne, go ahead.
Thank you, Kathryn. Very nice to meet you, and thank you for this presentation. And I think we should talk offline about this, but civil commitment stats would be great to have online directly each month because I'm on several committees at the state legislature and other places, and it's really hard to make policy if we don't know the numbers. And so I have contacts with my friends at SAMHSA in Washington, D.C., met with them, and I can get the numbers there. But I'd be really grateful if we could get that here in Oregon on time, and so we can help make better policy for civil rights. Thank you.
All right, Kathryn, we have... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have a few more quick slides. Mostly just touching on sort of leveraging these practices. So I can go fairly quickly and then we can transition because I realize we're coming up on time. But I just wanted to share, one of the spaces where we've really had a lot of luck is in sequencing these data practices. So that's really how we started to build our roadmap, is determining what's a dependency, what can be accomplished in 1 to 2 years or 5 to 7. And we've also created some fairly high level roadmaps that are not necessarily specific from a tactical perspective, but I think help us visualize where we as a state are headed. And thinking about sort of, as folks ask questions around like, how do we advocate for this within our organization? I think this roadmap really helps make the case for that central resource to drive your organization's efforts, right? So in order to get these fun, shiny new tools or these exciting things, you have to really leverage that centralizing force that's going to push things forward. We've also leveraged tools like dot voting, and I'll quickly just transition to these other few roadmaps. So these are, I call them proto roadmaps. They're like high level pictures of where we would like to head for some of these 3 strategic pillars. And you can see I've put these little map markers to kind of indicate where are we as a state right now. And in having the conversation with my Chief Data Officer Advisory Council, we really leveraged dot voting as an opportunity to say, I can activate this pathway. We also have these options around how we're leveraging data, how we're sharing data, and even how we're building data literacy. But I only have so many resources. So your job now is to help me determine where am I channeling that energy and effort. So I think just to kind of close out the process of getting from practices to sequencing and identifying those success criteria to building these initial roadmaps is a really helpful way. I mean, you can see there's no timeline on these, but they're definitely a starting point for us to know what does 2023 look like, what might 2025 look like, and as we go on. So with that in mind, I just sort of wanted to close that information out, and then I wanted to just transition us to questions, but thank you, folks.
You're supposed to let people sit awkwardly quiet until.
Well, I will say, Kathryn, thank you for the daily data on COVID numbers. It's amazing. I get those emails every day from OHA, and it's really good to have all that data coming out so we can know what's going on.
I'm glad, and this is one of those spaces again where my job is to really help support the agencies in being successful, right? So making sure that they have guidance on transparency and that kind of support. And as we build that culture of open data, as we've just now started to launch that program, is really helpful, right? Slowly, we kind of exercise that transparency muscle and we get more stronger and stronger at it.
I know you mentioned you may have bitten off more than you could chew with some of the audacious aspects of the program, but if you could look back at this point, is there anything for a group that might be starting out that could be like the pre-lessons learned, like really think about this that you might have done differently?
Well, so Bob, knowing that you're in the public sector, and this is probably a lesson that you have already learned, the time frame to do things like get a policy approved, right? That work, I think both public and private, the creation of the policy is one thing, but going through the process of getting it ratified and socialized, I think that's true probably even within larger private sector organizations. So building in that kind of generosity of review and approval really, I think, would have helped. The other place where I think we experienced maybe putting the cart before the horse a little is actually related to the data ethics framework. So originally my thought was, well, we'll build a data ethics framework this year and it'll help kind of build governance around AI. It'll help us set maybe some deeper principles for how we do or do not use things like automated decision systems. But the more we spoke to agencies, the more we realized again that literacy and familiarity with that language needed to be built first. So it might be that you find pockets of folks who are incredibly data literate, and then from an organizational perspective, many folks may not be steeped in that vocabulary. So literacy is kind of continually coming up more and more and subsuming these other aspects as well, that the socialization and the advertising and the guidance and the support associated with releasing a policy or engaging in a conversation around how we leverage data ethically takes more time and requires more level setting than I think we had originally built in. So for our ethics framework, where we're at now is this might be a planning year, right? Determining where the gaps are within agencies, what kind of vocabularies we're trying to build, seeing who already has folks responsible for that work in their organization, and then also tying into things like, the state's diversity, equity, and inclusion framework. So I think with that, building longer timelines for things like review and approval and vetting. I haven't struggled to get things like policies authored. It's really that second phase of how do we tell the story effectively so that people are bought into this. I think there's also this view of data governance specifically as like a thing you do only if you have time for it, which nobody ever has time for it. And we start to see real consequences associated with that, and building that narrative that people are already governing data, whether you have guidance for them on how they do it or not. They're just probably not doing it very well because they have no guidance on how to do it appropriately. And I think building that narrative in that case specifically at an executive level is really critical.
That's very insightful. Thanks.
I have a quick question about open data. In my experience, there's a pretty big difference between data being technically available and like genuinely accessible and usable by people. How do you think about that difference in the context of open data?
That is a very good point, and I think something that from a communication perspective with the public, Oregon is still working on. So there's sort of this baseline assumption that, well, Oregon can just kind of publish all of the data that it has and it will be great, right? We'll have access to it. It won't be a problem at all. But the level of contextualization and even sometimes curation that goes into publishing an open data set that the public can use really requires an additional skill set, right? So it's knowing kind of the literacy level of the constituency you're supporting, understanding, are we talking about like civic hackers and software engineers who want like APIs that they can immediately use to manipulate data, and then they're going to use their own like coding languages or analytic tools? Or when people say I want data, do they actually want a dashboard or some other interpretive tool to provide support to them? Our open data program, which I included some links to our open data website and then the program materials we've developed, leverage a metric called the 5-star model of open data. We adopted it from Tim Berners-Lee around like what is actually open data, right? So 1 star is the data is available, but it's like locked into a PDF report. And 5 stars is you've made the data available in a structured machine readable format with appropriate contextualization. And that's sort of the closing the loop piece of, is there a dictionary available to inform people of what's in that field? Is there maybe flagging around limitations with this data? So there's a margin of error for this cell size. Sometimes it's plus or minus 50%. Making sure that that is made transparent. And I think a space where we're still doing that work, and I think it ties into our ethics and equity work specifically, is making sure that there's clarity around how Oregon uses that data. So we collect this data and it's actually used to make decisions about XYZ, or we collect this data as part of administration of a program and it gets reported to the federal government. That kind of transparency hasn't fully been built yet. We also I'm actually hiring, or will be soon, a content strategist if anyone's interested in that type of work. But one of those reasons is because we have a transparency site, but we've noticed that making the language of bureaucracy transparent is really challenging. So we have a transparency site that includes expenditures and budget data, but it's written in I would say, a fairly still inaccessible format, just from a reading level expectation, right? You're kind of informed that if you're building web content, you really need to think 4th, 5th, 6th grade reading level. And we've done some readability checkers and we're at like sophomore in college. So knowing that we're already producing content that's maybe not legible for our constituents is a problem. And that's really where we're bringing in more roles around interpretation and visualization, and then even that awareness of like content strategy to flesh that out. So there's sort of this full circle the raw data is available, but maybe there are also mechanisms to engage with the data. And then we've got some other accessibility concerns around how are we describing the data and what kind of language are we using when we do so. And of course, all of this is predicated on digital access, right? So you've kind of already inherently structured in a burden for folks who may not have broadband technology or capability or computers or whatever else.
Could I ask more about digital literacy or data literacy, and how are you bringing that to different agencies? Because the ones I've worked with sometimes don't have that, or we work with people all over the state of Oregon. How are you bringing that in, Kathryn?
Mm-hmm. We are just now building actually a data literacy framework, and we're really structuring it around competencies based upon a role. And so even the phrase data literacy is very different for folks, right? So frequently where I hear data literacy is actually research analysts telling me that they're frustrated that folks who are maybe upstream of them in the data pathway don't understand how that data is used and might like put notes in a field that's not designed for notes, right? Or do things that kind of cause lack of cleanliness, all the way up to my executive thinks that I have like a magic, clean, perfect table that I can pull a report for them in 10 minutes. So that idea that there are different layers of data literacy depending on how close you are to the data, where you are in the management cycle of it, and even how involved you are with analysis is really important. And that's where we've seen, we launched a first attempt at a literacy cohort. And what we found is that absent that competency vocabulary, we had like folks with PhDs in machine learning and algorithms, right? And like leveraging algorithmic tools in the same room as folks who are like, I've just heard about this nifty data thing and I want to know all about it. So right sizing associated with skill set is really important, and even what we would expect someone in a position to know about data, which sort of leads into further discussion around like competencies as we put them into HR descriptions. But that's where we are now. So we're building that literacy framework to say kind of what are the different roles in the state that touch and manage data, and doing a little persona development. What competency might that person have? What might they expect from data? And where might they be interacting with it?
All right, Kathryn, now I'm going to not let there be any more uncomfortable silence because I want to respect everybody's time. I am always blown away by what you share. You've been a consistent presenter with TAO over the last few years, and thank you so, so much. And I have to say that your draw of a global audience has really elevated this TAO community. It helps me push our strategy forward that we need to continue having some online events, even when the world can go back and be in person, because I know that what you shared is really valuable. And I can't thank you enough. And it's so nice to see so many of you all here. And we're just tickled that we had somebody from Abu Dhabi attending. That is just like that's a big day in the TAO world. So thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Leanne and Matt. I'd like to give an especially big thank you to Matt, who has helped shepherd this TAO community through inception and an entire 18 months online. He is going to step down from his co-chair role moving into 2022. We are fortunate that Leanne is going to stay, and we will be doing an open call for community leaders. So stay tuned. That's in our newsletter. Again, thanks to CSG Pro, and we appreciate everybody putting this discussion together. One last thing, the feedback on your experiences today is super important. It helps us know what we're doing right and where we have opportunities for improvement. I know everyone is going to say, please host some events in person. Don't think I haven't heard that one once or twice in the last 20 months. So you're going to receive an email with a survey link where you can provide more specific feedback, and that input is super helpful. So with that, thank you. We look forward to seeing you in 2022 when our community events will be half in person and half online. At least that's our plan today, fingers crossed. Have a great rest of the day, week, and year, and we will see you back here very soon. Have a good one, folks.